All right, well, I watch a lot of games being played by amateurs, and in these kind of positions, they almost always play A8 queen, with the idea of forcing the black king away from the action so they can take the pawn and go over and get the pawn on the right side of the board. And the question is it really good to do that? So let's actually promote the pawn and let's play it out and see what happens. So A8 queen, of course, black's going to take, and now white's going to take the pawn and race for the rook pawn, and black's going to head toward the corner. And white's going to take here, and now black's going to go to either c8 or c7. It really doesn't matter. There's no horizontal opposition here or anything. So c8. Now if white moves his king out of the way of the pawn, black will just get in the corner with a well-known draw. The problem is if he blocks the black king out, the black king will go back and forth on f7 and f8 forever. And white has a choice. If he comes back, black will go in the corner. If he goes back in the corner, well, black's the easiest thing is to keep going back and forth. And now white can certainly stalemate himself by pushing the pawn if he wants to, like that. But in any case, once black's king reaches that critical c8 square, unless the pawn's already getting a queen, it's going to be a draw. So if you promote the pawn, the game's a draw. All right, let's try not promoting the pawn and see if that makes any difference. Suppose white says, I'm not going to push you back. I'm just going to take that pawn. And black says, well, I got to get this pawn sooner or later and then come back. So he takes the pawn, and white goes after the pawn, and black tries the same idea. And white takes, black comes back, and now white plays the key move, king to g7. And that blocks the black king out, and the next three moves will be to promote the pawn, and he wins. So this may seem a little bit illogical to some people, but actually pushing the pawn loses its tempo. Notice that when you push the pawn and black takes and white takes, black is now exactly 2 files behind white on the race across the board, which is exactly how close he needs to be to get his draw. While if white takes the pawn first and black has to go to the left and white goes here, now when black comes over, he can only get within 3 files of white, and that makes all the difference between a draw and a win for white. So pushing the pawn loses a tempo. Now why is that? Well, it's actually pretty easy. Black has to go to the A file anyway. Whether he's on A8 or A7 doesn't matter, because the amount of time it takes him to get over to, let's say, F8 or F7 doesn't depend on whether he's on the 8th rank or the 7th rank, because he can get over there in the same number of files that it takes to move. So when white plays king takes d5, black has to move left first and then go right to get to that file. It's the same distance that he would have to go if he had to take something. The problem is for white, if he pushes the pawn, that's an entire tempo he's spending not getting the pawn and going over, while black was going to go left anyway, like that. So therefore, when white takes here, black has time to come back. So the right answer is that pushing the pawn actually loses a tempo, which leads to a good general rule when you have these outside pass pawns, which is never push them further than it takes to deflect the opposing king. For instance, suppose it was a few moves ago, and white had his pawn, on A4, and black had the king on D6 or something. And now white plays A5, king over, A6, king over, like this. All right. Once the king leaves the pawn, you don't want to keep pushing the pawn. You're actually losing time. So here you can see it doesn't make any difference from the puzzle we gave in this one. It doesn't matter whether the pawn's on A7 or A6. In this position, if white pushes the pawn, it's going to be a draw. And if white takes the pawn, it's going to be a win. All right. So this position is winning for white. He has the outside pass pawn. By the way, if you take the black pawn off the board, then I wouldn't call this the outside pass pawn. This would be the only pass pawn. But when both sides have passed pawns, then the one that's further away from the other pawns is the outside pass pawn. So here white has the outside pass pawn, so he's winning, but only if he stops as soon as black leaves the pawn and he takes the pawn right away. As I said, the principle is, when you have those pawns, never push them further than what you need to deflect the king. Once the king is deflected out of the way, every time you push it, you're probably just losing tempos. All right, I see people do that wrong all the time, so I thought I'd make it a puzzle.